Well, hello there, and welcome to another segment of Warbird Wednesday. My name is Fred Bell. I'm the Vice Chairman of the Palm Springs Air Museum. I am here today with my convivial assistant. That's a fun one. Greg has picked a good name today, and you can tell we are extremely bored at the museum. Greg has also chosen a dignified hat. This is what happens when you let your staff have fun with you. You are running around with a chicken hat, pronouncing names that you really can't do. So I'm going to pull off my chicken hat here and toss it off to Greg off screen. We are socially distancing. Welcome to about 2 months of us being locked in the museum. You can tell we're having a great time. We're opening up the vault, and we're going to talk about, we've talked about weapon systems that have kind of gone by the wayside with modern technology. We're going to talk about a weapon system today. You know, at one point we discussed the Avenger and torpedo bombers, and today we're going to talk about dive bombers. Now, dive bombers during World War II were quite pivotal, especially in the Pacific and with the Germans at the start of World War II. We'll get into that. They are completely gone today. The best example of a dive bomber legacy would be certain cruise missiles when they come in over the horizon will pop up and come straight down on a ship. That's one of their tactics, and cruise missiles can do that, but that's about it. At the time, dive bombers were high-level aircraft. They had bombs attached to them, let's say a 500-pound bomb for the sake of argument, and they would do just what they talked about. They would dive straight down to the target. They were incredibly difficult to defend against, but their weakness was if they ran into a robust fighter defense, you know, the top speed, give or take, was 250 miles an hour-ish, or maybe a little faster, a little slower. They were not, because they had ordnance on them, they were not incredibly maneuverable. They were good at what they did, and they got out. They were typically used in combination with fighters that were providing fighter cover, and in the case of the Pacific, they were used with torpedo bombers. To great effect, I might add, the Japanese, with combined attacks with torpedo bombers and dive bombers, were incredibly effective early in the war against all kinds of Allied shipping. So let's get into it. Dive bombers, and the ones we're going to talk about today, most of them came into being in the late 30s. They were very, very rugged because they pulled a lot of G's in G-force in essentially these near vertical dives that they would make on the target. They were very, very hard on the air crews, and there were different technologies, I'm going to talk a little bit about that they could use to pull out of the dive and come out of it, but it was a very dangerous mission. As I said, they were extremely hard to defend against. Behind me over here to my left is a Bofors 40 millimeter anti-aircraft gun, which was standard armament on U.S. Navy ships, and they were upgunned and upgunned and upgunned, especially after the kamikaze attacks started late in 1944 and into 1945 as we got closer to Japan. All American warships were upgunning their anti-aircraft, or what they called AAA, anti-aircraft artillery, and the Bofors was part of that, along with 20 millimeters, 50 calibers, and very, very robust caps, combat air patrols with fighter cover. So this was a primary defense against those, and you can see, if you're defending against those, you could see this would pivot on this pedestal, but it can only go so high, and if the airplane is coming straight down on you, depending on where the ship is turning, it would be extremely difficult for anti-aircraft crews, if it was on the ship, for them to get a bead on it. It was likely that a nearby ship or anti-aircraft installation could fire on them, but they were dive bombers, extremely difficult to defend against. Now we have opened up the archive, so to speak. We're going to talk about it. We got just a lot of really cool stuff on the table today, and some interesting Fred fun facts. But as I mentioned before, we have about 30 or 40 ships, and we have a couple of examples here. The first one is the Yorktown. Now the Yorktown in this particular model, and Greg can get a shot of that, is in a pre-war configuration. You see all those biplanes on the deck, those beautiful yellow wings. I see some Dauntlesses there. I see some TBS, some Devastators, some torpedo bombers. And the interesting thing about this model, when you get here and you look at the museum, there are PBYs on the back of the deck. And this did actually happen because the Yorktown in 1940 was ferrying aircraft to Pearl Harbor. PBYs did not have the range to make it there all the way, and although they were an amphibian, you did not want to put a PBY down in the open Pacific. That wasn't really a good idea. So they were transported over, and then, and of course we lost the Yorktown at the Battle of Midway. We see one of her primary adversaries, the Imperial Japanese Navy ship, the Soryu. Now this ship was sunk at Midway, and this particular ship with the Japanese fast carrier attack groups wreaked havoc from Pearl Harbor all over the Pacific against British and Allied warships, and they were quite effective. Once the Battle of Midway happened, they lost most of their experienced air crews and folks that operated these ships, and the Japanese never recovered from that after Midway. Now on the table I have here, I have some cool models. We've talked about models, and we try to tie everything back to these the actual people that operated them, because it's one thing to see an airplane flying around, it's another thing to understand the people that operated it and the context of how it was operated in the particular engagement or in the particular conflict. This is one of the most iconic dive bombers that was ever built. It is the Stuka, the Ju-87, the Junkers Stuka. Very, very robust aircraft. Also, when I talk about the design philosophy, the Stuka, although it was a very good anti-shipping weapon, it was primarily designed to dovetail into the German tactic of blitzkrieg, which was lightning war, and the idea that you had aerial artillery, that these could drop bombs and punch a hole in an enemy's line, and then the Germans would punch through, and I'm being very broad brush this, and then fan out behind the enemy. That was the idea behind blitzkrieg. These aircraft were pivotal in that, along with the Me-109 and the Me-110s and the Henkels and 111s. The German philosophy and design philosophy on most of their Air Force was designed on close air support and supporting the ground units as they punched through or they were fighting. This philosophy later in the war would really come back to haunt them, because as they got into much larger strategic campaigns, when we've already talked about the B-17 and stuff like that, they had a very, very tough time both in strategic bombing and in coming up with a way to defend against a much larger American bomber stream and fighters. But this particular aircraft had a lot of innovations. First of all, it was double tough. A lot of this airframe was welded. It used unique metals that were designed to withstand it. You can see on the front, I don't know, Greg, if you can get a shot of this. You have the wheel. These are called wheel pants, and this is to provide some drag. And then below it are those little spinners. Now those spinners run sirens, and one of the things the Germans figured out was this airplane in a dive, and you've probably seen newsreels where they're kind of making that screaming, wailing sound. That is by design. That's to frighten the enemy. These were called the trumpets of Jericho, the sirens, and they would, when they went over into their dive, these things would spin and they would make just a horrific noise, and it was terrifying to both civilians and troops. Now I'm going to give you my first Fred fun fact. Greg, are you ready? Greg's nodding. He's ready. First Fred fun fact: the original Ju-87 flew with a British engine. The Germans ordered 10 British engines, and it flew with a British engine. The German high command and the group that made a decision on these airplanes was not really hot on that, and they went with another engine later, but it had a British engine in it. So you aficionados, go out and look that one up. This particular aircraft is in STG 77, which was a tactical bombing squadron. It also flew Me-110s, and Dornier 17s in a reconnaissance role. It was formed in 1939 and it disbanded in 1943. Why did that happen? Because the Germans no longer had air superiority and they were suffering terrible losses with their tactical aircraft like the Stuka. The Stuka did have a second lease on life, and that was it became a tank buster on the Eastern Front, and it was also used in naval warfare on the Eastern Front quite effectively. So that's the Stuka. The next one that we're going to talk about is the Val. Now remember, what is it about Japanese, and I'm referring to the Allied code name, Vals, bombers are women, fighters were men. So this is a Val dive bomber. Came into being about the same time in the late 1930s. By the way, there were about 6,500 Stukas built during the war. There was about 1,500 Vals built during the war. This has that kind of elliptical wing on it. Again, you see the same design philosophy as the Stuka with wheel pants with a fixed landing gear. Again, the performance in the airplanes are all similar in the 250-ish range of speed. Same design time. It came in the late 30s. Now this, again, primarily a ground attack. This aircraft was primarily used as a naval weapon. It was incredibly effective as a naval weapon at Pearl Harbor, at tons of engagements, and it was used in conjunction a lot with the Kate dive bomber, or the Kate torpedo bomber, excuse me, and it was very, very effective against shipping. Late in the war, it was again functionally obsolete. Mid-war, 1943, it found a new lease on life late in the war as a kamikaze airplane, which the Japanese were throwing everything they had at the American fleet. So you can see a very similar, although different, liquid-cooled radial. You could see very similar design philosophy. Now, if you were flying in those airplanes, and we've opened the vault, and Greg, I'm going to step back here a little bit, you probably, and Greg has an image of this, this is a Nambu. This is a Japanese officer's pistol. Now remember, all these weapons are inert. Don't play with guns, kids. And they all tell a story. This particular weapon actually has a story. As I said, it's inert. Has an exotic cartridge. I think I'm not a tremendous gun guy. You gun aficionados out there can get more into this, but about a 8mm cartridge or 9mm cartridge. The cartridge came in here, but you carried this, and Greg is actually going to throw up an image of a Japanese pilot in his belt. You might use this as point defense, and this is an artifact for the museum. Now, Fred, fun fact coming at you, Greg. Are you excited about this? My convivial assistant. This Nambu, the 14, was the basis, and it came back from a captured Marine. This is a Ruger 22 caliber pistol. I'm going to hold these up, and this is still sold. But look at this is essentially a copy. So this Ruger was basically not exactly copied, but was a design inspiration for this Ruger pistol. And I thought that was kind of interesting. Now, show you the difference in American philosophy. Nothing says I love you like your sweetheart's face on the grip of your pistol. This is a 45 caliber American pistol. This could have been carried by a pilot, perhaps a 38. They might have carried a 38 or a 45. Completely different design philosophy. This is called a sweetheart pistol or sweetheart grip. And you could go down, and Greg, I don't know if you can get the picture of that, but there is a story behind this one. When you come to the museum, you can find out about this. But this has the sweetheart grip on it. So run down to your local card shop and get your 45 with your sweetie on the pistol. You could actually do that at this time. This is an extremely rare weapon. So we're lucky to have this. And again, this pistol actually has a story that you can find out about. Now, we're going to move on a little bit. If you are interested, I'm just going to move forward a little bit. I moved out of frame with my assistant Greg catching up with me. Go out on the website and look, you can build all these cool ships puzzles. Look, all this stuff, and if you're sitting at home, there's nothing that says passing better time than a puzzle. We can use your donations and or your purchase at the gift shop and go out and do that. Now, one of the things that might happen, and I have another really cool artifact here, is these are Japanese Nikko binoculars from a Japanese warship, and there's a backstory in them, and they were standard pretty much on a number of Japanese warships during the war, but you never know. The Japanese lookout might be either seeing the ship or aircraft through these binoculars, but they have a story. They're back in our ship collection with everything else, and you can go check that out. Now let's move around here because we're going to get to the primary reason why we're here, and this is neat. This airplane was on the bottom of Lake Michigan, and we know the story behind this. This pilot, Lieutenant Roy Sorensen, was training on Lake Michigan on the Sable, which I'll get into in a minute, and he had some engine trouble and he ditched the airplane. Lake Michigan at that time during the war, in let's say 1943 on, they had a couple of freshwater carriers, and the pilots would go out there and do their carrier landings and their launches. They lost from that about 300 airplanes. Over 50 have been recovered from the bottom of Lake Michigan, and this was one of them. This is an airplane. This was one of the Palm Springs Air Museum's first restoration. The restoration on this airplane is about 20 years old. So it is in that kind of gradient Pacific color that we've talked about before, but it is in the original markings and the original designation of what came out of the water. And another cool thing about this was we actually found a dog tag, not Roy's dog tag, but a dog tag from one of the pilots that actually flew this airplane at one time. So let's walk around it. This is an SBD Dauntless, and if you're anything in history, you know that this is the hero of Midway. We'll walk around now, and I'm going to not hit my head there on the wing. I've already talked about there's some fabric on this airplane. One of the key features about dive brakes. Dive brakes are designed as the airplane goes into its dive. These are more like a scissors dive brake where they popped out. The Germans did an interesting study on the Stuka, and the Stuka had an automatic pull-out system on it, where the Germans did a study that if you did 8.3 Gs for more than 3 seconds, you would black out. And so they designed the pull-out system on the Stuka. When it reached that point, the Stuka would pull out. And I want to say it was about 1,400 feet. I could be off on that, but about 1,400 feet. The airplane had automatic pull-out flaps. The pilots that flew the Stuka did not like it because it gave the Allied gunners figured out where the Stuka would pull out, and a lot of them disengaged that system so they could pull out, which was pretty dangerous, but they didn't want to be predictable in their flight path, so they disengaged it. This aircraft, to my knowledge, did not have that type of system on it, but the idea that they're pulling, the Germans got up to 8.3 Gs, gives you an idea. That's a gravitational pull, pulling against you, and when that happens, you either gray out or you get tunnel vision and you black out. And if you black out, you're not coming back. You're going to go straight into whatever you're doing. So this was really dangerous work, and you had to be in good physical condition, and it was one of the areas where there wasn't a lot of margin for error as you were delivering that bomb. Now this is an SBD-5. There were about 5,000 of these built. About 2,500 were -5s. This is the -5. The last major engagement for the SBD was in the Battle of Philippine Sea in 1944. We launched 215 aircraft. 115 did not make it back because they launched later in the day. And some of you history buffs will know they turn on the carrier lights, and a lot of the pilots could find it. But a lot of air crews were lost because they had to ditch. Some of them were recovered, some of them not. But think about that. We launched 215 airplanes, and over half of them didn't come back. in the context of today's world, imagine with social media and all that other stuff, what people would be completely freaking out. That is not an uncommon occurrence. We've talked about that before with just terrible losses at Midway with the torpedo bombers, 42 of 51 being shot down. So this is you can see that dive break. We're going to move around a little bit, and we're going to go. We talked about cutaways. We've got some great cutaways here. Why don't you come on around? And for my cutaway, I'm going to do my stage 2. And Greg has outdone himself. This is a brainwash carbonated drink. You probably can't get it on camera. It is a very scary blue color. And my salute today is I want to say thank you to the Blue Angels and the Thunderbirds and all those flights that they're doing over all the cities for America Strong. Thank you very much, guys, for doing that, and we appreciate it, and we salute you. Wow. Greg, I'm going to set that one down and not carry it around with me because that, whoa. Okay, well, that was interesting. By the way, Brainwash is not a sponsor of our, it's not a sponsor of our segment. Whoa, okay, well, it lived up to his name. It kind of fried my brain. We got a great SBD cutaway here. This cutaway shows there's a life raft here. You can see all the inner workings of the airplane. You have a rear gunner with 30 caliber machine guns, twin machine guns. You get a good shot of the flaps. You could see Roy Sorensen actually came back in the restoration of this airplane. When we restored it, we also have all of his original flight gear. He went on to have a career in the Navy, and we have some pictures that Greg will put up. He actually had a career in the Navy, but we have his gear from World War II, his squadron jacket and all of his stuff. It's very cool. And then the other thing we have here, we talked about these carriers. I'm going to step over here, Greg, and work to my right. This is the Sable IX-81. These were just essentially, these were built on early 20s side paddle wheelers. They had a paddle. They didn't have screws. And they just built a flight deck on there. There was no hangar deck. The Sable, unfortunately, was scrapped. It would have been great to have one of these. One of the other ships was named the Wolverine. Interesting thing about the Sable, it did 117,000 carrier landings, and it trained about 18,000 pilots. Another Fred fun fact, and this is how all these things are interconnected, which is, in my book, just the coolest thing in the world, is that the George Bush trained on the Sable when he was doing flight training. So George Bush was on this ship, so was Roy Sorensen. So there's all that interconnectivity. We've already talked about Bush and his later adventures in the Avenger, but you could see all of the inner workings of this particular airplane. They were extremely rugged. It did not have folding wings, and the reason it did not have folding wings is it was a dive bomber. They were worried about structural weakness in it, and you also have how they would incorporate those dive brakes. So it did not have folding wings. You can actually see the wing construction on this, and again, a lot of these aircraft were welded. They weren't riveted, and they were made out of different alloys to make them a little tougher. But you can see how this wing is extremely rigid. It has the birdcage canopy. As I said, the airplane was pretty much obsolete by 1944, and what ended up happening is it was retired, and the Helldiver came in, and the Navy relied more on the Helldiver late in the war and basically phased them out. They were still doing carrier training and carrier quals up towards the end of the war. So this is the SBD Dauntless. This is an airplane that you need to check out here at the museum. It is another individually tied artifact to an actual person who was involved in the war. My name is Fred Bell. I want to thank you for this walk around, coming with me. Remember, smash that subscribe button. We can use your donations. and hit that gift shop. You want to pick up that cool puzzle. Thank you very much. Have a great day.